Hey everyone, have you ever looked at your M365 licensing and just kind of wondered to yourself, why the heck is this stuff so complicated? I've gone through that process so many times of looking at Microsoft 365 licensing, trying to true it up, trying to change it, optimize it. It's such a complicated mess. You almost need a PhD to just wrap your head around it, right? So what I thought we'd do with today's episode of the SysAdmin DOJO Podcast is we sit down with M365 expert Paul Schnackenberg to talk about why the heck Microsoft 365 licensing is so complicated. We're going to talk about licensing SKUs, who the intended audience is for certain SKUs, you know, whether you should use add-on packages or go with the bundles, all that coming up next on the SysAdmin DOJO Podcast. Well, hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the SysAdmin DOJO Podcast, the podcast designed to help you become the kick-ass system administrator within your organization. As always, I'm your host, Andy Serwich, and I've got one of our more prolific authors out on the Altero Dojo with us today. I got Paul Schnackenberg. How's it going, Paul?
I'm pretty good. How are you, Andy?
Doing good. It's probably a nice, bright, sunny morning for you there in Australia, right?
It is indeed. It's heading towards midday, but it is sunny, yes.
And it's a nice dark evening here on the eastern U.S. I don't want to say coast because I'm in Michigan, so you can't really say coast, but the joys of technology and Teams, right? Recording a podcast with two different people on opposite sides of the planet in two different time zones, wildly different time zones, I should say. So
wildly different, that is for sure.
Definitely, which is kind of, speaking about Teams, kind of a nice segue into today's topic, and I specifically wanted to talk about licensing in the M365 space. Now, we're having a podcast episode about licensing here, so the first thing I have to do is say neither of us are licensing experts. Everything we say in the show today is based on our understanding of Microsoft licensing, and remember that licensing is a legal issue, and if you have any question whatsoever in terms of licensing, highly recommend you check with your Microsoft licensing specialist before you make any decisions around licensing. So now that I
absolutely
have made,
I would also add that everything we say today is based on our understanding today.
That's very good point.
This stuff changes regularly, and we probably should have a little mention at the end that there has been price increases as well. We should cover that a little bit. So things do change regularly. Definitely.
So now that we've made the lawyers happy, we can kind of get into the topic of today's discussion. And really what I wanted to focus on was the complexity of it. So if I go back to kind of the precursor to M365, which was BPOS, Business Productivity Online Suite, I think is what that acronym stood for, right? Way back in the day. Licensing was relatively simple, but now that we've got M365, we got all these different services. They keep adding services to the M365 suite, almost like they're adding services to Azure, right? The licensing has gotten a lot more complicated, and it's been a year or two now, but there was a time where I was working for a CSP for a year here, and on the regular was helping organizations true up licensing or optimize their M365 licensing. And I got to say, you almost need to have a PhD to understand M365 licensing these days. I think you've probably run into the same thing, right, Paul?
I have indeed. Yeah. Look, it is a challenging area, and it's true to form, like Microsoft licensing, whether you talk about Windows Server or Exchange or SQL Server, like for decades. And now in the cloud, has never been an easy road. It's never been simple. And that's obviously by design. Like they're doing it that on purpose. And some of these things I'm sure we're going to touch on today, why they do that as we go through, what we're talking about here.
Definitely. So with kind of the introduction of the topic out of the way, I just kind of wanted to dive right in here. And I think when I start talking about M365 licensing, the first thing that always comes up is this whole business SKU versus enterprise SKU type of thing, right? So, for those that are familiar, even if you're not familiar, you really have two different sides on the M365 licensing. You've got the business line of M365 licensing, and then you also have the enterprise line, which, you've probably heard terms like E3, E5. These are licensing options. And the first thing I wanted to start with, Paul, and maybe you can give us a quick rundown, is what are the big differences between those two different branches, if you will, of Microsoft 365 licensing?
Absolutely. So actually, I'm going to take one step backwards first and cover one more even fundamental building block here. So there used to be Office 365.
Right.
And this is something that people often confuse, right? There is still Office 365 E3 and E5 licensing. We'll come back to that later on. But on the Microsoft 365 side, what you have is all of the Office things plus all of the Azure Active Directory, Intune / Endpoint Manager, plus other security things. So that's covered in the EMS suite, which we'll talk about later as well. So think of Microsoft 365 as Office 365 plus a bunch of other stuff. Right. So that's the first one.
Yep.
There used to be Office 365 for small businesses, but that doesn't exist anymore. So on the business side, the business premium and business apps, they are all just Microsoft 365. So there is no Office there anymore. It's always Microsoft 365. The main point there is it tops out at 300 users. So if you have more than 300 active users, you really need to go to an enterprise plan. However, I would caveat that because some people just think, okay, well, that's the rule, easy, right? I've got 150 users, we're going to do business. I've got 350 users, we're going to do enterprise. The one thing you want to think about there, and this used to be stronger on the a few years ago because there were a lot of security features missing. So I would have companies come to me with 10 lawyers and people in an office, right? And they'd say, well, obviously we're going to go with business. I'm like, no, you actually need a lot of these security features. So even though you're only 10 users, you're still going to be better off with one of the enterprise SKUs. Now that has changed recently. So under business premium only, you have a lot of security features, right? So they used to not be there in that SKU, but they are there now. So to me, a small business that doesn't have really advanced security needs, business premium is fine, right? But if you need the really advanced security features, you want to consider going with the enterprise SKUs anyway. Like I'm paying for a Microsoft 365 E5 for my business, and there is one of me, but I want all the security features. So, that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And, I think about, I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit more in the next couple of sections here, but, I look at all those different security features. Not only do you need the extra licensing for that, but there's also a skilling part of that in play as well. Yep. You need to understand how to leverage those features as well, or go with a third-party option too is always an option too. But I'm sure we'll get into that too as we get a little bit further. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but so we've kind of broken down the key difference between the two branches of licensing, right? So we've talked a little bit about business, a little bit about who it's for. There's some caveats again, like you said, about maybe you're in a small business, but a regulated small business, or there's some need for security. You'd be looking for some. You might be, like you said, you might be looking at the enterprise SKUs, right? Which brings me to my next area that I wanted to cover. So you start looking at those enterprise SKUs, and again, we have lots of letters, right? We've got the F series, which we'll get to. I know I keep saying that, but we'll get to the F series here in a second because it's a whole thing by itself. And you've got E3 and E5 are the other two big ones. And I think, if looking at my own experiences working with customers over the last several years, I want to say that in my travels, I've seen E3 kind of be like the de facto standard for most organizations. But E5 has a lot of different bells and whistles in it as well. Knowing that we're going to come back to the F series in a few minutes, What are the big differences between E3 and E5, Paul?
Right. So you can think of Microsoft 365 E3 as Office 365 E3 plus EMS E3, right? So basically you get Azure Active Directory Premium P1, you get Intune level 1 basically, and you get all the productivity features. So, your Exchange Online and SharePoint Online and Teams and Yammer and everything else just comes with it, right? And you're certainly right. The Microsoft 365 E3 licensing is sort of the certainly in medium to large business, this is sort of like that's where you start, like that's your default entry point. Now, when you go to E5, we get a whole heap of more advanced security features. So Azure Active Directory Premium P2 comes with more advanced identity protection. So it uses machine learning and AI to identify risky users and risky sign-ins. You can build conditional access policies around that. You get Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, what used to be called Cloud App Security, which is a CASB. You get that fully, with a full feature set in E5. You get Defender for Identity, so you run agents on your domain controllers on premises to identify all the risky stuff. Microsoft does that automatically in Azure Active Directory, but for your on-premises Active Directory, you need Defender for Identity. With E5, you also get Defender for Endpoint. This is a full-fledged cloud-powered endpoint detection and response tool. And people tend to think, oh yeah, well, that's for Microsoft Windows, right? That runs on Windows, Linux servers, it runs on Mac OS, it runs on iOS, and it runs on Android. So it covers all the major platforms. Plus a whole heap, like we could sit here for an hour and just talk about all the different security features that come along. So if you are a business today that say, hey, we're going to stick on E3, I would seriously consider using a third-party product, because you do need to unlock some of those advanced features in today's landscape. Right. So Hornet Security, our parent company, has 365 Total Protection. That's one example of something that you could add on top of E3 to get the same level of security features. Right. And that brings me back to the, what we mentioned earlier is skilling, right? I mean, that's just one caveat that I think of. And I try really hard not to do the hard sell on this show, because we want to stay as vendor agnostic as we can, right? Totally. But if I put my system engineer hat back on and jump back in the trenches, I start looking at implementing security features in M365, and maybe for example, let's say I'm a 500 user manufacturer. For the vast majority of my manufacturing floor staff, F1 SKUs are fine, which we're going to get to in a second. But maybe I've got a mobile sales force of 20, 25 people, and I want them to have some advanced security. Now, I could go with, like an E5 for those users, but I have to keep track of that. I have to license, it's a whole thing, wrapping and managing the licenses, right? Whereas you go with like a third-party service, again, picking on ourselves, like Hornet Security, we don't care what the underlying M365 license is, right? So, yeah, that's, again, for me, it always comes back to skilling, because if we've got E5, we've got all these great security features. My team has to know how to install them, configure them, and manage them as well, right? Whereas a third party, you get some of that added benefit of not maybe having to worry about the setup and as difficult of management and configuration, right? So again, not trying to do the hard sell, but just, trying to look at it objectively from a, the conversation always comes down to like whole hog Microsoft everything, or bring in third-party services for various benefits and reasons, right? Exactly. And you bring up two good points there, actually. The one that I should have mentioned earlier is when we're talking about this, like if you have 1,000 staff in your business, we're not talking about everybody having to have the same, right? Like you don't have to have Microsoft 365 E3 or E5 or whatever across all of those users. You can mix and match. Now, you can't really mix business and enterprise, but within the enterprise family and within the business family as well, you can have some users on some SKUs, some users on other SKUs, and that makes a big difference there as well. And I really like the skilling thing you're talking about, because I did hear a colleague of mine over in Europe. He was tasked coming into a business, and they were actually paying for Microsoft 365 E5 for all their users, but they had no idea how to use the advanced security features.
Right.
They hadn't turned any of them on.
Right.
They were paying for it, but they had no idea. Like they didn't even realize what they had.
Yeah.
So that's really important, right? Like technology is one thing, but you need the people and the process around it. As you say, you need to have the skills, you need to have the processes around actually using all those security features. So that's an absolutely excellent point.
Yeah, exactly. I think of things like AIP, you know, Azure Information Protection. I think there's so many acronyms. There's the name of the feature escapes me, but there's a whole suite of features in E5 that's specifically designed to prevent insider threats within your IT organization.
Insider risk management.
Yes, thank you. That's the one. So, I mean, you've got those services that I have to believe that there's a small subset of M365 enabled organizations that are actually leveraging them. I mean, that's like we've been talking about. That's a whole nother level of security thinking and maturity. And you know, if you're paying for E5 and you're not leveraging those features, it's just lost value, right?
Exactly. And especially when you're talking about E5, but even if you're talking about just general adoption of Microsoft 365, like there's a lot of features and there's a lot of things that keep on changing, right? Like the days of saying, oh, Office 365 is just hosted SharePoint and Exchange, right? And we'll just keep doing what we did 10, 15 years ago. It's just Microsoft is running the servers for us. Like that's not a reality today.
Right.
Like that's far from a reality. Like if you don't have a plan to help your users actually adopt the new features, whether that is a new button in Teams or it's your IT people doing a new security thing they couldn't do before, right? Whether one or the other of those two, right? If you don't have a plan for that, if you don't actually have time and staff allocated to actually do that training, you're missing out on value, right? Like you can pay for Microsoft 365 E5 or E3 or whatever, but if you're not using all the features, as you say, you're leaving money on the table, right? And you might even end up in a situation where people go, well, we're going to use this other service over here, a third-party one, and you're like, no, it's built in, right? And they go, well, nobody told us that. We didn't know we could use that, right? So that is really important. If you're going to pay Microsoft for the higher licensing SKUs, have a plan in place for adoption. And that is not a let's do it now and then we're done and we can move on to the next thing. That is a continuous adoption of new features on a regular basis. Right. How do you train your staff? How do you help them adopt to all these new things, right? That's really, really, really important, because I think a lot of businesses, as you say, they have they're paying for it, but they're not using it, or they're using 10% of it.
Right. Yeah. So, you know, like I've had this conversation a lot with, you know, customers and people in the community, in that, you know, they recognize that that's lost value on the table, and the choice comes down to, well, hey, you know, I can skill up my team, right? And we can have a go at enabling all these features. The other side of it I see is that's part of the value that third-party providers in the M365 space provide, us included, and anybody else that provides third-party services in the Microsoft 365 space. Part of the value there is companies like us making those features and those services easy, right? To try and take some of that management burden off of their shoulders. So,
okay.
Yeah, so we've been talking a lot about security, which drives me to my next thing here. And again, adding to the different layers of complexity, we've got Office 365 versus Microsoft 365. We've got enterprise versus business. We've got these different SKUs inside the enterprise side. One thing you mentioned in a couple of minutes ago was EMS. EMS is a add-on, quote unquote, add-on to M365 that stands for Enterprise Mobility and Security. Now, to make things more complicated, can you kind of run down what EMS is, Paul?
Yeah. So originally, so this is sort of a historical thing, really. So a few years ago, before there was Microsoft 365, there was just Office 365.
Right.
So you had Office 365 for business, you had Office 365 for enterprise, right? So E3, E5. The Office 365 for enterprise is still around. You can just get that. Gives you SharePoint and Exchange and all Teams and everything else in the cloud, but no other security features. However, and no other features whatsoever. With enterprise mobility, and so back in those days, Microsoft sold, right, you need to buy Office 365 E3 plus EMS E3, right? So
right.
you'd have the sales thing where you asked people to buy two things, or E5 Office 365 and E3 EMS, or Office 365 E5 plus EMS E5, right? So it got sort of messy, and I think that's one of the reasons they went with the, hey, let's just combine EMS E3 with Office 365 E3 and call it Microsoft 365
right.
E3. And the same thing with the E5 SKUs, right? So that sort of made sense, right? Now you just buy this one thing. Now, so EMS gives you, it gives you Azure Active Directory Premium P1 in E3 or P2 in E5. It gives you Intune. So this is the really important thing, right? Because if you look, say, 10 years ago, right, most businesses were managing their on-premises Windows fleets and maybe a little bit of Mac, and they were managing it with some sort of on-premises tool, right? System Center Configuration Manager, third-party tools, whatever they were using, right? But mobile devices weren't such a big part of the landscape, right? Now, today they definitely are, right? So you need a mobile device management solution. You need a management solution that will take care of all the devices, no matter where they are. So that covers your iOS, your Android phones and tablets, and it's going to cover your Windows and Mac devices, right, wherever they are. And today, of course, given 2 years of pandemic, lots of people are working from home, and even long before we had a pandemic, people were working from wherever they wanted to work, sort of thing. So you need a solution that works very well in the modern world, and that's what Intune is, right? So Intune lets you manage those devices, put policies on them, configure their security, push out configuration things like Wi-Fi and hundreds of other settings to them, manage the software on them so we can push out applications, right? So you got your iOS phone, I can push out an application to it that I want you to have. I can separate your business data from your personal data, so you can have your pictures of your children from the Star Trek convention you just went to, but I can separate that data from the business data documents you've got in there, right? So if you leave the company or if you lose your phone, you think maybe you've lost it, I can wipe your corporate data, but not touch the rest of it, right? Then you find your phone had slipped in behind the cushion in the couch, no problem, right? You haven't lost all the pictures of your children. So all of that is what you get with Intune. And then in the Azure Active Directory space with P1, you get conditional access, which is all part of this overall security zero trust push. You get conditional access policies that allows you to say, Andy can log in from a corporate-owned device in this country to these applications, but if he's traveling and he's coming in from a personal device and he's in this country, he can't access these particular highly sensitive applications. And if he accesses these other ones, this other data or whatever, we're going to ask him to do an extra MFA or whatever, right? You get all of those sort of control features.
Gotcha.
And then with Premium P2 in Azure Active Directory, you get identity protection with machine learning. We mentioned that before. You also get privileged identity management. So your administrators are ordinary users. Most of the time when they want and need to go and do some admin stuff, they elevate their privileges temporarily. They kind of do an extra MFA there. They maybe have to enter a ServiceNow service ticket number or something else. Maybe it has to be approved by somebody else. Then they become an administrator for a short amount of time, 2 hours, 4 hours, whatever, and then they get kicked back to an ordinary user. So if that account is compromised, it is not such a destructive thing for the business, right? Because that user, that attacker who now pretends to be Paul the administrator, has to elevate, right? And hopefully you got some processes in place there to stop that being an automatic process. So that's one of the things you get. Plus there's a bunch of other stuff as well.
Yeah, I mean, we could we could do a whole series of podcasts just on the different, I mean, just in Azure Active Directory itself, right? You know, you've mentioned Azure AD P1, P2. Now, while we're talking about add-ons, those are options you can get as separate add-ons too. Like if I wanted to, for some weird reason, to run, you know, a business SKU of M365 and then go add on Azure AD P2, I could, right? And the weird thing about that is, last time I looked, it depended on region that you were in. Some of these add-ons you could get in certain regions, most regions, but I know there's some that you can't get those features in certain regions. The other thing that I've run into is, and it always comes down to, you know, I guess this is one of the common questions that I always come into in this part of the conversation is, I end up with customers who are looking at all these different add-ons, EMS being the big one, right? But then they get into the weeds on the Azure AD P1, P2. I know some of the Defenders you can get ad hoc as add-ons as well. They get down into the weeds on these add-ons, and then the question is like, well, you know, is it better to go with like lesser, like it's hard to explain, the smaller licenses, the cheaper licenses, I guess, and then do add-ons as needed? Or is it just better to go with like the E3 and the E5 out of the gate, right? That's always the question that comes up.
Totally, and it is a perfectly valid question. So that is another thing we probably should have mentioned in the beginning. So the E3 and E5 SKUs on the Microsoft 365 side, they're actually a collection of individual licenses. So you could tailor make exactly what you need for a particular user. Now, let me start off by saying, if you're a small business, don't worry about this. Like, it's not worth your time.
Right.
But if you got thousands of users, right, and you go, well, these thousands of users are costing me $10,000 a month, maybe I can get that down to $5,000 a month by tailoring exactly what they need. So you can go in and buy the individual products a la carte. Like, as with most bundling of things, though, there comes a time when, as you start adding more and more add-ons, you get closer to the full SKU, and then it's just easier to buy the full SKU.
Right.
So it depends. I'll give you one real-world example. A client of mine, they have their own IT department. There's about 450 odd users in the entire organization. They got an IT department of 6 or 7 people now. And they were looking at privileged identity management, the specific, hey, we just want these 4 or 5 administrators in that organization. When they need to elevate, they need to do that on a time basis, right? And it was part of a regulation they have to follow. So in that scenario, they are not going to adopt all the other features in Microsoft 365 E5 at this point in time, right? So they are on Office 365 E3, I think, the basic SKU on Office side. So they don't have any of the other security features, but they could say, okay, for these 7 users or however many there are, we're going to buy Azure Active Directory Premium P2 as an add-on for just this one feature. Right. So it makes sense, but you got to look at it, and you got to look at how many users you have and whether it makes sense to build your a la carte scenario with the right add-ons. And the other thing that you need to be aware of is things tend to change over time. So maybe you say, hey, these 1,000 users over here, they only need these features. And then after 6 months, when they start using all those features, they go, well, we'd like to do that as well. And we'd like to be able to do this. And then you go, oh, okay, well, now we actually need this other licensing over here. So, you know, it gets complicated.
Yeah, definitely. And that was one of this very situation. I've been in this situation many times with many different customers I've worked with over the years, and it's the situation that you just described is like, hey, we had like this one obscure security feature we wanted to use. We implemented it, and then we wanted more, right? So what I found is that these organizations are perpetually in this state where they are constantly doing like a costing exercise, like, okay, well, what if I did this? Is it cheaper? What if I did this? Is it cheaper? And they're constantly reevaluating and massaging their entire licensing strategy, and it becomes really time consuming, right? So that's again, that's kind of that's almost the very situation that prompted this episode, right? Is because at the end of the day, it just turns into this big complicated mess, right? And that was the whole the whole thing that prompted this episode. So it's funny that you mentioned almost the exact situation.
Yeah, no, look, it does get very complicated. And I would say to an organization that spends that much time and energy on trying to shave the pennies on their monthly bill, I would say, well, how much are you paying that IT person who's doing that on like a part-time job basis at this point, right? Is it really worth it?
Right.
Like, do you really gain that much? And should you maybe have that staff train all the ordinary users so that they're going to be more efficient in using Office, and your whole fleet of people will be much more productive overall, right? Maybe that's a better use of their time, right? So there's certainly a balance there, for sure.
Definitely. So to add to the complexity, we mentioned this a few times in our conversations thus far, and that revolves around the SKU series of licensing. Now, again, kind of a history thing here. There used to be an E1 SKU in the M365 stack. That's since been replaced with F1 and F3. And the first thing that everybody asks is like, okay, well, what does the F stand for, right? E is enterprise. What does F stand for? And that's frontline worker, right? And once they know what the F means frontline worker, the question is, what the heck is a frontline worker, right? And the way it's always been explained to me is like, those people that are on the front line, right? Like your nurses, your manufacturing floor staff, the people who they need access to email and Teams and maybe the occasional file, but otherwise they're doing other things with their job that don't necessarily require a computer, right? I think that's about it, right? Is there anything else that you would add to that definition, Paul?
No, the way I think of frontline workers is it is all the people who are not working in front of a computer all day, right? All the people who are not information workers. So as you mentioned all these different examples, right? Shop floor attendants, all these people who do need access to technology occasionally, but it is not their main part of their job. So for those, and of course, for every information worker, there's probably 5 or 10 times as many frontline workers, right, worldwide. And Microsoft is making a big push into that space and have been for several years because it makes sense, right? Because those people can be a lot more productive if they have the right digital tools to help them out. And that's where the frontline workers come in. That's where Shifts comes in, which is one part of Microsoft. They have this booking features so that you can schedule that, hundreds of people on a shop floor or whatever, they're going to do different things at different times. You can schedule them all. You can manage all of that in the tools built into Microsoft 365. Again, obviating the need to use a third-party service for that specific thing. Right.
And so the last time I looked, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think what I found interesting, especially about the F1 SKU, is that I think it actually omitted email, right? That was like a Teams only with a couple of additional features on the F1 SKU, if I remember right. I'd have to go look specifically. It's been so long.
Could be. We actually have an excellent article on exactly this coming up on, no, F1 still has email. No, you're right. The F3 SKU has email and calendaring, but the F1 does not. You're right. So there's F1 and F3, and that's one of the differences between them. And also, they don't get Office on their local machines, right? Word and Excel and PowerPoint on their local machines. They get the web-based interfaces. Again, the assumption is that the nurse doesn't have her personal computer that she's on all day. She's doing the nursing thing, and then at the end of her shift or something, or beginning of her shift, she goes to a shared computer, logs in, checks her email, checks whatever else she needs to check, and then she logs off.
Yep, that makes sense. So yeah, kind of covering a lot of different bases here. Microsoft is covering a lot of different bases here, different types of workers, different types of organization, all coming down to options, right? And I mean, I guess where that ultimately leads most organizations is just the simple question of, what should I choose? And most of us IT people are going to get, most managers would love to strangle their IT people who say the answer to this question. But the answer to this question is always, it depends.
Depends.
Right? It depends.
Yeah, it totally depends, right? It absolutely totally depends. My recommendation would be 2 or 3-fold here. Sit down and work out where you are at the moment. What licensing do you have at the moment, right? Are you on Office? Are you on Microsoft? What mix of licenses do you have? Then look at your business needs, right? So don't think so much about this is what Microsoft offers. Look at your business needs. What do we need? Where could we be more productive? Where could we change business processes if we had the right digital tools in place, right? It's all about digital transformation and understanding that, right? Like if you're an old school IT person, you just go, oh, well, they just need email and we're done, right? Like, you're missing out on the whole Teams thing, right? That's just not how it works today, right? You got to be on the modern train here. Secondly, I would look at, okay, now you've figured out what your business needs are. You say, okay, so what gaps do we have in the licensing that we need to look at? And then whether that comes down to changing this overall SKUs, whether it comes down to doing some a la carte stuff and picking some individual ones without making it too complicated and having somebody, spend 20 hours a month actually trying to change that every month, right? But making it, having a good look at it, say once a year or something. And then, as I said, no matter what you actually choose, that is what you think is the right solution for you at this time, right, as a business, then make sure that you have the training, make sure you have the adoption plans in place to help people actually use the technology and actually implement it and gain the benefits of it. And that does not matter whether you're a small business or a big business, right? This idea that staff is going to pick it up just because you put the tool in front of them is just not, like, that has never worked and it will never work. And
right.
I'm a Microsoft certified trainer, so I'm probably going to be on my soapbox here a little bit, but that idea that people are going to, and when they do figure it out themselves, everybody's going to do it slightly differently.
Yep.
There's not going to be a cohesion, there's going to be confusion, and there's going to be a lot of lost productivity, not just because people are doing it in a more complex way or not the right way or whatever, but also because they're going to keep asking each other, hey, Andy, can you come over here and help me? I don't know how to do this in Excel, right? Great. Now I've taken you away for 10 minutes from your productivity work, and then you come over and help me, right? Like it's not the right approach. You have to understand that people have to be trained to actually and continuously trained, right? It's not a once a year, hey, here's the new version, be happy with it. This is a continuous thing because it keeps changing every month, right? So every day. So
my favorite thing, you mentioned, if you don't train your users, they're going to go try and figure it out on their own, right? My favorite story, I guess, or my favorite situation, maybe not my favorite, depending on the way I look at it. Anyway, what I've seen happen in this situation is I've seen organizations that, hey, we've deployed SharePoint, go use it. And they've not put any controls in place as to who can create SharePoint sites or how, and you end up with SharePoint sprawl at the end of the day, right? And at that point, it becomes so difficult to wrap your hands around it because you have 2,000 SharePoint sites out there, all doing different things, some of them not being used at all, and so
the governance is really important. And I often hear this, and I still hear this from businesses, right? What if we train our staff and they leave? And my answer is always, what if you don't train them and they stay? What's that going to give you, right? What's that going to give you, right?
That's a good one.
You wouldn't do it in any... The funny thing is that people have this idea about IT, right? Like if, let's say you had people, I don't know, building motor cars in a factory floor. Like you wouldn't assume that you just hire somebody with an engineering background that it automatically be in the Tesla, factory putting together Teslas automatically. No, you train them so they're doing the right thing when they put together each car, right? And this is the same thing. The only difference is that how you put together a car hopefully doesn't change every week, but how you do stuff in Office changes regularly.
Yep, that's about right. Can you imagine if if cars were like, the change rate that we see in Office or Azure. Oh, this week we've added, these 15 new features to your car. I don't want to think about that.
I don't know. Maybe we'd have flying cars by now, though. Who knows?
That's true. That's true. Well, Paul, the one thing I want to wrap up with really quick is resources. So if I'm new to this space, or I'm just trying to find some sanity in dealing with my Microsoft 365 licensing, are there some resources out there that I can use to kind of help navigate and wrap my hands around this?
Yeah, so there's some basic, we'll put this into the show notes, but there are some basic websites that Microsoft has where they compare the features of each of them. When you want to go a little bit deeper and actually understand what each individual licensing option offers you, there's something called the service descriptions. I think they've changed names recently, but the website is the same. These go thoroughly deep, like it tells you exactly what you get with an Exchange Online P1 license, right? It tells you exactly what you get, how much storage, how much everything else. So the service descriptions are really important. And then a plug for the Dojo website. As I said, we have an article coming out shortly on the frontline SKUs that goes deep on all of that. We have a couple of other articles around Microsoft 365 licensing as well, which echo a lot of what we've just talked about here today. So we'll pop those in there as well.
Definitely. I stumbled across one the other day, M365maps.com. That's a really cool tool because it actually visually shows you like, hey, these features are in this license. And what I found interesting the first time I opened that was just I was kind of staggered by the visual complexity of the SKUs. Like having it visualized in like a map format, it's just like whoa, hey, there's a lot here, anyway. So I'll be sure to get that in the show notes as well. So, and then
that's a great one.
Paul, if people have follow-up questions, how can they reach you? Probably out on the dojo is a good place. I mean, you can leave a comment on any of your articles, right? But other than that, how can they reach you?
Well, I'm on Twitter. It's probably the easiest way. So at Paul Schnack, PaulSchnack on Twitter. Or you can email me, paul.schnackenberg@hornetsecurity.com. It's another way of getting hold of me.
You're a brave man. So, no, it's okay.
We got good spam filtering.
We do. That's right. I had Ben Armstrong on the show a couple episodes ago, and he put his Microsoft.com email out there, and he said, I've never been burned by this in the last 15 or 20 years. And I'm just like, please, Ben, let this not be the show that finally burns you, So anyway. Well, I think that's about all the time we've got for today. So, Paul, I want to thank you for stopping by to share your knowledge on this. I'm sure we'll be talking about 365 licensing again here sometime in the future in some way, shape, or form. So good to have you, my friend, as always. And
it was excellent.
Yeah, it was fun. We're going to have to do it again sometime. And those of you watching, thanks for tuning in today. As always, you can go out to the Altero Dojo for lots of great IT pro-centric content. So again, that's altero.com/dojo. We've got sections for VMware, M365, Hyper-V. We've got some Azure content out there, MSP, backup and recovery, choose your poison. Got a lot of great content out there. Other than that, stay tuned for future episodes of the SysAdmin DOJO podcast. Thanks for watching, and have a great day. Hey everyone, it's Andy again. Hey, thanks for watching the episode today. Hope you enjoyed it. One thing I wanted to leave you with, we've been talking a lot about Azure Stack HCI, Hyper-V, hybrid cloud, and a lot of the recent episodes. Wanted to let you know that on March 23rd, we are running a webinar that talks about all things Azure Stack HCI and hybrid cloud. Now, you can register for that webinar by clicking on the link in the description of this episode. And if you're watching or listening to this episode after March 23rd, you can use that same link to watch the webinar on demand. So hope you enjoy it. Again, we hope to see you for a future episode of the podcast. Have a great day.